For 15 years, a certified check for $5,000 showed up at my post office box every single month, with no name on it anywhere. Then one morning, a courier knocked on the door of the animal shelter where I work and handed me an envelope that said I was being summoned to a trust office downtown. I thought I was being sued. Instead, a stranger's lawyer read me 3 words that changed everything. Because you mattered. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. I never thought of myself as someone extraordinary things happened to. My life ran on a schedule built entirely out of other creatures' needs. I'm a veterinary technician at a small nonprofit shelter tucked into the mountains outside Asheville, North Carolina, and most mornings started at 6 a.m. mucking out kennels before the vet even arrived, because the dogs didn't care what time it was, and neither did their bladders. I'd get my son Theo and my daughter Ruby to the bus stop, drive 20 minutes up a switchback road to the shelter, spend the day elbow deep in a job that paid just enough to keep us fed and never enough to save, then drive home and do the whole second shift, dinner, homework, baths, before collapsing in front of whatever show I never finished watching. I want to be honest that I didn't hate my life. I love the work in the exhausted, unglamorous way you love something that also empties you out by 4 in the afternoon. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being the person a scared animal decides, against all odds, to trust, and I never got over how much that mattered to me, even on the worst days. Theo was 11, and building increasingly elaborate contraptions out of spare parts he found in our shed. At one point, a pulley system for hauling his backpack up to his treehouse that I still don't fully understand the physics of. Ruby was 6, and had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist despite the fact that we lived 400 miles from any ocean, a detail that did not appear to concern her in the slightest. I just didn't have any slack in the rope. Rent on our little rental cabin outside Marsh Hollow ate 1/3 of my paycheck, and the rest went exactly where you'd expect it to go, with nothing left to spare and no real hope that would change. I kept a running list on the fridge, in dry erase marker, of things we needed but couldn't afford yet. New brakes, Ruby's shoes, a dentist visit I kept pushing back another month. The divorce from Theo's and Ruby's father, Grant Whitfield, had been final for 4 years by the time the first check arrived. Grant had left when Ruby was 2, not dramatically, just gradually, the way some marriages end, less a door slamming and more a door someone forgets to keep holding open. He worked in sales for a building supply company an hour away and had, over the years, developed an increasingly fluid relationship with the concept of a due date on child support. He'd since moved in with a woman named Nicole Hart, who ran a boutique wedding planning business out of a converted barn and had, on the 2 occasions I'd met her, the specific energy of someone constantly composing a caption in her head. I remember the first check with a clarity that surprises me even now. It arrived on a Wednesday in April, tucked into my post office box along with a water bill and a flyer for the county fair. A plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from a trust company 2 counties over that I'd never heard of, Ridgeline Fiduciary Services. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me for $5,000, no note, no explanation, just the check itself and the trust company's name printed along the top. I stood at the counter of the little post office in Marsh Hollow holding that envelope for what felt like a full minute while the postmaster, a kind older man named Curtis who'd known me since I was a kid, asked if everything was all right. I told him I wasn't sure yet. I drove straight to the trust company's address, which turned out to be a modest brick office above a hardware store, and asked to speak to whoever had sent it. The woman at the front desk, after checking with someone in the back, told me the check was authorized, intentional, and tied to an account she wasn't permitted to discuss. When I asked whether I should just tear it up and forget it, She looked at me with something like sympathy and said, "Ma'am, it's already cleared through our system. What you do with it now is between you and your conscience." I didn't cash it for 6 days. I called a free legal clinic that met Tuesday evenings at the community center, and the volunteer attorney there, a retired public defender who mostly handled landlord disputes, told me that as long as I hadn't solicited or defrauded anyone to get it, an unrequested check wasn't something I was obligated to return. It was, strange as it felt to hear out loud, simply mine. I paid off the balance on Ruby's asthma inhaler, which insurance never fully covered. I fixed the check engine light on my car, which had been on so long I'd started treating it as ambient decoration. I put what was left in a savings account and spent the next month waiting for someone to show up and ask for it back. No one did. The following month, another check arrived in the same plain envelope, postmarked from the same trust company. And the month after that, for 15 years, on or around the second week of every month, a $5,000 cashier's check found its way into my post office box, and in all that time, I never once learned who was sending it. There was one month, in year 9, when the check simply didn't come. I remember the specific panic of it, checking the box 3 days in a row, then 4, convinced that whatever quiet arrangement had been supporting us had finally ended without warning, the way these things always seem to in the version of a story that plays out in your head at 2 in the morning. I'd already started recalculating our budget around its absence when it turned up on the 9th day, a full week late, with a small handwritten note from the postmaster taped to the envelope explaining a regional mail delay. I sat in my car outside the post office and cried harder over that one late check than I had over almost anything else in years, because it was the first time I let myself admit how much I'd come to depend on something I still didn't understand. Not for lack of trying. In my 6th year of receiving them, I drove back to the Ridgeline office and asked to see whoever managed the account directly. I was told, politely but firmly, that client information was confidential and that the account had specific instructions never to disclose the source without either the source's consent or a court order. I didn't have grounds for a court order, and I definitely didn't have the money to pursue one. I let it go, mostly the way you let go of a question you've decided you're not going to get an answer to. So I built a life around money I couldn't explain. It covered the gap between my paycheck and our rent. It paid for Theo's tutoring when he started falling behind in math, and for Ruby's inhaler refills every winter without me having to choose between that and groceries. I was careful with it, and grateful for it in the abstract, the way you're grateful for rain in a drought, aware I hadn't caused it, unsure when it would stop. I told almost no one. My sister Diane knew, because I couldn't carry a secret that size entirely alone. My closest friend at the shelter, a woman named Priya who ran the intake desk, knew too, because she was the person I told things to during slow afternoons when the kennels were quiet. Grant never knew. I made absolutely sure of that. Then, on a Thursday morning 15 years and 2 months after that first envelope, I was cleaning out a kennel when one of the shelter's front desk volunteers came back to find me, looking oddly formal, and said there was a courier at the front asking for me by name, requiring a signature. My stomach dropped before I even reached the lobby. Couriers requiring signatures had never once meant good news in my experience. The man handed me a thick envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize, Voss and Okafor, attorneys at law, along with a clipboard. I signed with hands that weren't entirely steady and opened it right there in the lobby, certain I was about to read that I was being sued, audited, or both. Instead, the letter requested my presence at their downtown office at my earliest convenience regarding, in its exact words, the final disposition of the Blue Ridge Promise Trust. I had never heard that name before in my life, but something about the phrase final disposition made my hands go cold anyway. I called Priya, who covered my shift, and I drove down the mountain that same afternoon with my heart doing something uneven and fast the entire way. I remember very specifically rehearsing, out loud, alone in the car, All the reasons a law firm might need to see me in person that had nothing to do with money. Unpaid fines from years ago, some old lien on the cabin I didn't know about, a mistake with my taxes, anything that felt more plausible to me in that moment than good news. Because good news of that scale had simply never once been on the list of things that happened to people like me. The office, when I found it, was smaller than I expected. 2 rooms above a bookstore, warm light, a receptionist who offered me tea before I'd even sat down, which somehow made me more nervous rather than less. A man introduced himself as Daniel Voss, mid-50s, calm in the specific way of someone who delivers difficult news for a living and has learned not to rush it. Before he said anything else, Voss slid a thin folder across the desk toward me unopened. "I'd normally walk you through the background first," he said, "but I've learned it's kinder to say the number out loud before someone staring at documents trying to do the math themselves." He folded his hands. "Ms. Cross, I want to tell you plainly, because I don't think there's a gentle way to lead into this. A trust that has supported you for the past 15 years has just been fully and finally distributed into your name. The total transfer is $61 million. I don't remember what sound I made. I remember gripping the arms of the chair like the floor had tilted. There's one more thing," Voss said more gently now. "The person who established the trust left a message to be delivered to you exactly as written. 3 words. He turned a small card toward me across the desk. Because you mattered." Voss walked me through the basic shape of the trust while I sat there trying to keep my hands from shaking around the teacup the receptionist had brought, the account, the schedule of monthly distributions that had quietly run for 15 years without my ever knowing there'd been a formal structure behind it, and the specific, unusual instruction attached to the final transfer, that it be delivered in person with the 3-word message read exactly as written, no more and no less, so that the money never arrived without the reason attached to it. As Voss put it, quoting language directly from the trust documents. I asked him at one point whether he knew who had established it. He told me he did, but that the person had specifically requested his identity be revealed only after his death, through a separate letter Voss wasn't yet authorized to share, and that death, he confirmed gently, had occurred 4 months earlier. I sat in that office for a long time after I could form sentences again, and when I finally drove back up the mountain, I didn't go home. I went to the shelter, let myself into the back kennels after hours, and sat on the concrete floor with an elderly beagle named Otis who'd been surrendered by his owners the week before and hadn't stopped shaking since. I stayed there with him for almost an hour, not because I needed to be useful exactly, but because tending to something else's fear has always been the only way I know how to get a handle on my own. Somewhere in that kennel, with Otis's head heavy on my knee, I finally let myself cry. Not from fear, not exactly from joy, but because somewhere in those 3 words was an answer to a question I hadn't realized I was still asking. Once I'd stopped shaking enough to drive, I went home, put the kids to bed an hour early with the vague explanation that Mom had a headache, and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to think clearly about what I knew and what I didn't. What I knew, someone had quietly supported me for 15 years in amounts specifically calibrated not to draw attention, and had now made one final, enormous gesture that could only mean they were done giving, the kind of gift a person makes when they know there won't be another chance. The 3 words implied a debt, a reason, something that had happened before I was old enough to know about it. Because you mattered. Not I love you. Not I'm sorry. Mattered. A word that implied weight, importance, a life that had been worth something to someone I'd never met. And whatever that reason was, I was almost certain it traced back to my father. My father, Samuel Cross, died when I was 23, a heart attack in the garage behind our house, where he'd spent 30 years running a small towing and auto repair business that served half the county. He'd grown up in these mountains, learned engines from his own father, and never in his life, as far as I knew, done anything more dramatic than change a stranger's tire in the rain. He was quiet in the particular way mountain men of his generation often were, Capable, unhurried, allergic to being thanked for anything. He kept chains and a winch in his truck every winter without fail, the same way some men keep a spare tire, just in case someone needed pulling out of a ditch. He used to say that a man who wouldn't stop for a stranger on a bad road wasn't a man he wanted to know, and he said it the way other fathers might quote scripture, matter of fact, unquestionable, not up for debate. He never once mentioned anything about a specific night, a specific stranger, a specific storm. Looking back now, I think that omission was the loudest thing about him. He wasn't a man who hid much as a rule. He simply didn't think what he'd done was worth the space it would take up in a conversation. I have exactly one memory from childhood that, in hindsight, might have been a clue. I was maybe 9, riding along in his tow truck on a call, and I asked him why he always kept a blanket and a thermos in the cab even in summer. He shrugged and said, "You never know who's going to need it and when," and changed the subject to the radio. I hadn't thought about that exchange in 15 years, until the night I sat with his cigar box open on my lap. Because you mattered. What had my father done for whom, and why had the debt come due to me instead of him? I sat with those questions until close to midnight, and then a second, more practical worry settled in, tightening my chest in an entirely different way. $61 million was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet in a town where everyone's business eventually became everyone's business. It would draw attention from the IRS, from banks, from lawyers, and from people in my life who had shown very little interest in my finances until now. People like Grant. Grant had left our marriage citing, in his words, wanting a version of life that wasn't just bills and bedtime routines. He paid child support the way some people keep New Year's resolutions, earnestly for a while, then inconsistently, then only when reminded. He'd been living with Nicole for 3 years now, and between the two of them, I sensed an appetite for exactly the kind of windfall that had just landed in my lap. Grant didn't know about the 15 years of checks. I'd kept that secret with real discipline, a separate account, careful about which of my friends overlapped with his circle, never a slip in conversation. 15 years, that discipline had held. $61 million was not going to hold the same way. It was only a matter of time. By the time I finally went to bed, I had the outline of a plan, even if it wasn't sophisticated yet. First, I needed someone I actually trusted to help me think clearly, because Daniel Voss, however kind, still worked for the trust, not for me. Second, I needed to understand who had sent this and why, because that answer mattered to me in a way that had nothing to do with money. Third, I needed to move carefully enough that Grant didn't find out before I'd protected the kids from becoming leverage in whatever came next. The next morning, I did something that surprised even me. Instead of hunting for a big city lawyer, I walked next door. My neighbor, Ruth Okafor, was 71 years old and had spent 30 of those years as a family court judge before retiring to a little house up the ridge from mine, where she grew tomatoes and, as it turned out, occasionally handed out legal advice over the fence. I'd borrowed her ladder more than once. I'd never once thought to ask her anything about trusts. I told her everything, sitting on her porch with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us, the whole story tumbling out faster and messier than I'd intended, the certified letter and the courier and the number and the 3 words and my father's cigar box I hadn't even opened yet, all of it out of order and half finished. She listened without interrupting once, which I was starting to recognize as a skill certain people simply had, the kind of stillness that comes from 30 years of letting other people's worst days sit in a room without rushing them along. When I finally ran out of words, she topped off both our mugs before she said anything at all. "The name of that firm, Voss and Okafor, that's my nephew's practice," she said. "Daniel's good, thorough, careful with people, which matters more than most lawyers understand." She turned her mug slowly in her hands. "But you need your own counsel in this, not the trust's. Somebody whose only job is looking out for you and those 2 kids. Full stop, no other client in the room." She was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle over the ridge behind her house. I'll make the call myself if you'll let me. I know exactly who you need, and she won't waste your time. I asked her, half joking, whether being a judge for 30 years had prepared her for literally anything life could throw at a person. She laughed, short and dry. 30 years on the bench teaches you that nobody's story is as simple as the first version they tell you, she said. Yours isn't either. Go find out the rest of it before you decide what any of this means. Within 2 days, I had my own attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Anand, no relation to my friend at the shelter, a coincidence that made both of us laugh nervously during our first meeting. Priya moved fast. She filed the paperwork to establish a family protection trust that would hold the funds separately from me personally, with an independent trustee for the first year. She brought in a financial planner named Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken man who talked about money the way a good mechanic talks about engines, as a tool, not an identity, and together we built a structure, a college fund for Theo and Ruby that neither of them could touch until 25, a modest reserve for me, and the beginnings of an idea I couldn't yet name, something in my father's memory. Marcus had a habit, in those early sessions, of stopping partway through a spreadsheet to ask a question that had nothing to do with numbers. "What does a good week look like for you right now?" he asked once, and I remember being genuinely stumped, because no one had asked me that in probably a decade. I told him a good week was one where nothing broke. Not the car, not the water heater, not anyone's health. He wrote that down like it mattered as much as any asset allocation, and told me the whole point of what we were building was to make sure a broken water heater never again had the power to derail my entire month. It was such a small thing to say, but it was the first time the money had felt less like an enormous, frightening abstraction and more like a tool I might actually learn to use well. Ruth, for her part, refused to take any formal role in the process, insisting she was just the neighbor with the ladder. But she showed up anyway, at the second meeting with Priya, at the first meeting with Marcus, sitting quietly in the corner with her coffee, occasionally asking the one blunt question everyone else had been too polite to ask. "And what happens," she said during that second meeting, looking directly at Priya, "the day Grant Whitfield finds out?" Nobody had an answer yet. It was the right question to be asking. "This is the most important thing we do this week," Priya told me as I signed the paperwork. "Before you spend $1 of it, before you tell one more person than you already have, this is the lock on the door." I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt since the courier first knocked on the shelter's door. Not calm exactly, steady enough to keep standing. Grant found out 2 weeks later, and not the way I'd feared. It wasn't a banker's gossip or a courthouse leak. It was Theo. He'd spent the weekend at his dad's, and somewhere between a basketball game and dinner, he mentioned, innocently, proudly even, that Mom had taken him and Ruby to a really cool office downtown with a fish tank and a lady named Priya who gave them lollipops, and that Mom seemed like she'd been crying happy tears about some kind of trust thing. He was 11. He had no idea he was handing his father a loose thread to pull. Grant called me that Sunday night, his voice doing the careful, casual thing I remembered from our marriage, the tone he used right before asking for something. Theo mentioned some lawyer's office. "Some trust thing," he said. "What's going on, Elena?" "It's not something we need to discuss over the phone," I told him, keeping my voice level despite the way my pulse had picked up. "If you have questions, they go through my attorney, Priya Anand. I'll text you her information. Come on, we don't need lawyers for a conversation." "We do now," I said, and I meant it. "Good night, Grant." He didn't call back that night, but I knew, the way you know weather is coming even before the sky changes color, that this wasn't over. I spent the next several days bracing for a follow-up that didn't come right away, which was somehow worse than if it had. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head while I cleaned kennels, arguments I hoped I'd never have to actually have out loud. Priya told me, when I called her in a mild panic on day 4 of silence, that the quiet was almost certainly strategic. "People like your ex don't usually come in swinging right away," she said. They go find out what they're dealing with first. She was right, as it turned out, though it would be another 2 weeks before I understood exactly what finding out what he was dealing with had actually looked like from his side. In the meantime, I told the kids as little as I honestly could get away with, which is a strange kind of parenting math, wanting to protect them from a storm you can already see building on the horizon, while also not wanting to lie outright to 2 children who were smarter than I sometimes gave them credit for. Theo, in particular, seemed to sense something had shifted, and asked me once, apropos of nothing during a car ride, whether we were rich now. I told him we had some extra help that let us worry a little less, and that nothing about our actual life together was going to change unless he wanted it to. He seemed to accept that, mostly, though he did immediately ask if this meant we could finally get the dog he'd been lobbying for since he was 7. I told him we'd talk about it. We got the dog 4 months later. That week, I did something I probably should have done from the start. I went looking through my father's old things. In the back of his garage, behind decades of tools and spare parts, I found a metal cigar box he'd kept on a high shelf my whole childhood, one I'd never been allowed to open as a kid and had never thought to open as an adult. Inside was a single black and white photograph of my father, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing next to a teenage boy in front of his tow truck, both of them bundled against obvious cold. Underneath, it was a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed and soft at the creases, dated January 1988, from the local paper. A brief item about a bad ice storm that had stranded several vehicles on the mountain pass, with a single line near the bottom mentioning that a local mechanic had pulled a stranded teenager from a car before it slid off an embankment. No names in the clipping beyond my father's, but tucked behind it, in my father's own handwriting on a scrap of paper, was a first name, Owen. I spent the following weekend at the Marsh Hollow Public Library, the kind of small-town library where the periodicals room still has an actual microfiche machine nobody's gotten around to replacing. The librarian, a woman named Carla who'd known my family for decades, listened to the little I was willing to explain, and then spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon helping me dig through archived business journals, county newspaper reels, and old Chamber of Commerce newsletters, trying to find any thread connecting the name, Owen, to that January in 1988. It was slow, frustrating work, reel after reel of unrelated headlines, obituaries, high school football scores, and by early afternoon I'd nearly convinced myself the name in my father's handwriting was a dead end, maybe not even related to the clipping at all. Then Carla, scrolling through an old regional business quarterly almost as an afterthought, stopped and turned the machine toward me without a word. It was a 20-year-old magazine profile of a tech entrepreneur named Owen Bradshaw, founder of a robotics company that had gone on to become one of the largest employers in the Research Triangle. Near the end of the article, almost as an aside, the interviewer had asked him about an early formative experience. Bradshaw's answer, quoted directly, stopped me cold. When I was 17, I ran away from a bad situation at home during an ice storm and ended up stranded on a mountain road in the middle of the night. A stranger pulled me out of a car that was about to go over an embankment, fed me at his kitchen table, and never once asked me a single question I didn't want to answer. He put me on a bus the next morning with $40 and his own coat. I never got his name. I've spent 20 years trying to find him. I read that paragraph 4 times. Carla, watching my face, quietly asked if I needed her to print a copy, and I nodded because I couldn't quite manage words yet. She printed it, and then, without me asking, spent another hour helping me pull everything else the library's database had on Owen Bradshaw. Later interviews, a short piece about the sale of part of his company, a brief mention of a foundation he'd started that funded rural infrastructure grants across 3 states. None of the later material mentioned my father by name. But by the time Carla finally had to lock up for the evening, I had a manila folder full of enough pieces to know, with something close to certainty, exactly whose life my father had quietly saved on a mountain road nearly 40 years before I was even born. I sat in that periodicals room with my hand over my mouth for a long time. My father had never told anyone. Not my mother, not me, not a single soul in 30 years. He had pulled a frightened, runaway teenager out of the dark on the worst night of that boy's life, and then simply gone back to fixing transmissions on Monday morning like nothing had happened, because that was exactly the kind of man he was. Owen Bradshaw had died 4 months earlier. I learned from a follow-up search, from complications of early-onset Parkinson's. He'd spent his final years, according to a short obituary in a business journal, quietly funding rural community programs across western North Carolina for reasons he rarely discussed publicly. Daniel Voss confirmed the rest when I brought him the clipping. Bradshaw had spent years trying, through private investigators of his own, to identify the mechanic who'd saved him, and had finally succeeded a little over 15 years ago, not long before my father's death. He'd established the Blue Ridge Promise Trust almost immediately after, with instructions that monthly support begin the moment Samuel Cross's household showed financial need, and that the full remainder be distributed only after Bradshaw's own death, to whichever of Samuel Cross's descendants was raising children of their own. That had been me. Daniel Voss, when I brought him everything Carla and I had found, confirmed what I'd already suspected and filled in the pieces I couldn't have known on my own. Bradshaw had hired his own investigators years earlier, trying from his side to track down the mechanic who'd pulled him off that mountain road, and had finally succeeded roughly 16 years ago, not long before my father's death, which meant, Voss said gently, that there was a real possibility the two men had spoken again before the end, though nothing in the trust documents confirmed it either way. What the documents did confirm was that Bradshaw had established the Blue Ridge Promise Trust almost immediately afterward, with explicit, notarized instructions. Monthly support was to begin the moment Samuel Cross's household showed financial need, monitored quietly through public records, and the full remainder was to be distributed only after Bradshaw's own death, directed to whichever of Samuel Cross's descendants was at that time raising children of their own without adequate support. That had been me, and had been me for 15 years before anyone ever told me why. Grant showed up at my door the following Sunday with Nicole beside him, holding a folder, and I knew immediately what kind of visit this was going to be. "We need to talk," Grant said. "You can say it right here," I told him, not stepping aside. Nicole spoke first, in the practiced, gentle voice I imagined she used on nervous brides trying to talk themselves out of a difficult family seating chart. "Elena, we're not here to cause problems," she said, hands folded around the folder like it was something delicate rather than a weapon. "We just think, given everything, it makes sense to revisit the custody arrangement. Sudden changes like this can be destabilizing for kids. Grant's worried about consistency for Theo and Ruby." She said the children's names carefully, deliberately, like she'd practiced getting them right. I looked at the folder in her hands. "Destabilizing," I repeated. "Grant's been late on support 9 months out of the last 12. "That's not what this is about," Grant said, jaw tight. "I think it's exactly what this is about," I said. "Any concern about custody goes through my attorney, Priya Anand. If you file anything, you'll be filing against a fully documented trust, 2 children with education accounts already established, and a track record you don't want a judge examining closely. Think carefully before you do that." Nicole's polished expression thinned. "You're not being reasonable." "I'm being exactly reasonable," I said. "I'm also done standing on this porch." I looked past her at Grant, who hadn't said more than a handful of words the entire time. "You know exactly what this is. I hope it was worth showing up here with a folder instead of just calling me directly like an adult." He didn't answer that. I closed the door. He filed 2 weeks later anyway, not a claim on the money directly, which Priya said he had no legal path toward, but a petition to modify custody, citing a materially changed financial and emotional environment as grounds for him to seek primary custody of Theo and Ruby. I understood immediately what it actually was. He couldn't touch the trust. But if he had the kids most of the time, he'd have leverage over every decision involving them for the next decade, including, eventually, how any of that money might someday be spent on their behalf. The hearing was held in family court on a Wednesday morning in a plain, overlit room that smelled like old carpet and coffee. I'd worn the one blazer I owned that didn't have a stain on it somewhere, and I remember sitting in the hallway beforehand feeling strangely calmer than I expected, mostly because Ruth had shown up unannounced to sit in the gallery, telling me only that she'd seen enough bad custody petitions in her career to know one when she smelled it. Priya sat beside me, with a folder considerably thinner than Grant's attorney's, a man named Preston Hale who had the over-rehearsed confidence of someone used to winning through paperwork volume rather than substance. Judge Elaine Marsh presided, 60-something, unhurried, the kind of judge who read every document in front of her before saying a word, and who, I noticed, glanced briefly and unmistakably at Ruth in the gallery with something like recognition before the hearing began. Hale opened by arguing that the sudden acquisition of significant wealth had introduced instability and unfamiliar pressures into the children's home environment, and that a modified custody arrangement, granting his client primary physical custody, would serve their best interests during this transition. Judge Marsh looked up over her glasses. "Counsel, is there any documented harm to these children you're prepared to present, or is this petition based entirely on the fact that their mother came into money?" Hale adjusted. "We believe the change in circumstances alone warrants review." "The children's welfare is already documented," Priya said, sliding a folder toward the clerk. "Both children remain enrolled in the same school, same home, same routines. Education trusts were established for both, with an independent trustee, specifically to prevent any disruption to their daily lives. Ms. Cross has not missed a single day of work since the trust was distributed." Hale called Grant to the stand briefly, and I watched him testify that he was simply concerned about consistency for the children, that he'd noticed Theo seeming distracted during recent visits, that he believed a review of the custody schedule was in the children's best interest and not connected in any way to the trust. Priya's cross-examination lasted less than 4 minutes. She asked him to confirm the dates of his last 6 child support payments against the court's own records, which showed 3 of the 6 arriving more than a month late. She asked him whether he had, in fact, asked his attorney to investigate the trust's total value before filing the custody petition. Grant hesitated long enough that the hesitation answered the question on its own, and then admitted, quietly, that he had. Hale pressed further afterward, raising vague concerns about unknown financial actors now connected to the household, given the trust's unusual origin. "The origin isn't unusual, it's simply private," Priya said, and placed a second document. "The Blue Ridge Promise Trust was established by Owen Bradshaw, founder of Bradshaw Dynamics, in recognition of an act performed by Miss Cross's late father, Samuel Cross, in January of 1988, when Mr. Cross rescued a stranded 17-year-old from a vehicle on Route 9 during an ice storm at his own risk and asked nothing in return. Mr. Bradshaw's own recorded statement, filed with the trust documentation, confirms the gift was intended solely for Samuel Cross's descendants, with no connection whatsoever to Mr. Whitfield. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when a plan visibly runs out of road. I watched Grant's jaw tighten, watched him lean toward Hale and murmur something. I had decided in the car that morning I wouldn't look at him during any of this, because looking at him would make the moment about him, and it wasn't. Judge Marsh took off her glasses. "Mr. Hale, I'm going to be direct. I see no evidence of harm to these children, no evidence of instability, and a financial history from your client that raises more questions about consistency than your petition does. I'm denying the request for modification. And I'll note for the record that petitions motivated by a change in the other parent's finances, rather than any genuine concern for the child, are not what this court exists for." She glanced at Grant. "I'd think carefully before filing again." Priya squeezed my hand under the table. Outside in the hallway afterward, she told me plainly, "That's over. Hale will tell him to drop it, because Hale's expensive, and there's nothing left to win here." She was right. Grant didn't file again, and in the weeks that followed, there wasn't so much as a certified letter or a follow-up call from Hale's office. Priya kept an eye out anyway, checking periodically for any filing in a different county or under a different legal theory, and found nothing. Whatever pressure Grant had hoped to apply had used up all its force the moment it met an actual courtroom. Word moved through Marsh Hollow the way it always does in a small place. Not because I told anyone, but because family court dockets aren't secret and small towns talk, and half the county seemed to know somebody who'd been in that courtroom or heard about it secondhand within a week. I didn't take any particular pleasure in that, generally speaking, but I won't pretend there wasn't a certain grim satisfaction in how quickly the story reorganized itself around the actual facts instead of whatever version Grant might have preferred people believe. Within a month, Nicole's wedding planning business, which relied heavily on word of mouth in a community now aware of exactly how the custody petition had gone, had quietly lost 2 of its 3 fall bookings. Grant, according to Theo, had also had some tense stuff at work, which I didn't ask about and didn't need to. 3 weeks after the hearing, a small wooden crate arrived at my door, shipped from an estate attorney's office in Raleigh handling what remained of Owen Bradshaw's affairs. Inside, carefully packed, was my father's own code, an old canvas work code I recognized instantly from photographs, the one detail Bradshaw had apparently kept for over 3 decades. Beneath it was a small handheld cassette recorder and a single tape labeled, in shaking handwriting, for Samuel's daughter. I sat on my kitchen floor that night after the kids were asleep and pressed play. Owen Bradshaw's voice was thin, clearly recorded near the end of his life, but steady. He described the ice storm. He described being 17 and terrified and out of options, sliding toward an embankment in the dark, certain it was over. He described a set of headlights, a stranger's hands pulling him free, a warm kitchen, a bowl of stew, and a man who never once asked why a teenager was alone on a mountain road at midnight. He just said, "Eat first, questions later," and there aren't going to be many questions anyway. He gave me his own coat the next morning because mine hadn't dried, put me on a bus, and told me to go be somebody. I spent 20 years trying to find him again, just to say thank you properly. By the time I did, it was almost too late. So I did the only thing I know how to do when I can't say something out loud. I found a way to say it in numbers instead. Your father never wanted a single thing from me, so I made sure the debt landed on someone who'd let me pay it. I hope that was all right. I sat with that tape for a long time, and then I found my father's old cigar box again, and finally understood what I was looking at. Not just a photograph and a clipping, but the only physical trace my father had ever kept to the one time, as far as I know, that he let himself be seen doing something extraordinary. I played the tape again the next night, and then the night after that, until I'd nearly memorized it. And each time I noticed some small new detail I'd missed before, the slight tremor in Bradshaw's voice near the end, clearly a symptom of the illness that would eventually take him, and the way he laughed, briefly and almost embarrassed, when he described the code. I still have it, he said at one point, and I remember rewinding that specific line 3 or 4 times, because I hadn't realized until that moment that the coat in the wooden crate wasn't a copy or a replacement. It was the actual coat my father had handed a frightened teenager on a mountain road nearly 40 years earlier, kept safe through decades of a life neither of them could have predicted, and finally sent home. I called Ruth over the following week and asked if she'd listen to it with me, mostly because I didn't think I could sit with it alone a third time. She came down with a thermos of tea and sat beside me on the porch while I played it, and when it finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "That's the thing about debts like that. Money can close them out on paper. It never quite finishes paying them. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. It's been just over a year now since that courier first knocked on the shelter's front desk. I used part of the trust to start the Samuel Cross Rural Response Fund, which helps stranded drivers and struggling families across 3 mountain counties with the kind of quiet, no questions asked help my father used to give away for free his entire life. We've already covered towing costs for a dozen families who couldn't afford them, quietly paid off 2 overdue heating bills during a January cold snap, and kept the fund's existence deliberately low-key. No plaques, no press releases, nothing with my name or my father splashed anywhere prominent, because the entire point was to build something that behaved the way he did, not the way a foundation usually behaves. I still work at the shelter 3 days a week because the work was mine before the money was, and it'll still be mine long after the money has settled into something ordinary. We bought a small house with actual insulation and a yard big enough for the 3-legged shepherd mix we adopted last spring, whom Ruby named Compass, for reasons she has never fully explained to my satisfaction. Theo wants to be a mechanic like his grandfather, a fact that still catches in my throat every time he mentions it, and he's already started asking Ruth's nephew, who runs a garage 2 towns over, if he can come sweep floors on Saturdays just to be around engines. Ruby has, this month at least, settled on marine biologist, and I've stopped pointing out the ocean situation, mostly because Marcus, of all people, found her a summer program at an aquarium 4 hours away, and now I don't have much of a leg to stand on. Grant and Nicole moved 2 counties over not long after the hearing, and while I still see him at pickups and drop-offs, something in the dynamic between us settled into something quieter and more businesslike than it had been in years. I felt no triumph in any of it, only the quiet settling of a scale that had been tilted for a while and finally leveled out on its own, the way a truck finally sits right on its wheels again once you've torqued down the last bolt. I still keep my father's coat folded in the bottom drawer of my dresser, exactly where the crate arrived. I haven't decided yet whether I'll ever wear it, or whether it belongs somewhere else entirely, maybe hung, eventually, in the little building where the Rural Response Fund keeps its supplies, so it can go back to doing what it was always meant to do. Some decisions, I've learned, don't need to be rushed. My father taught me, without ever once meaning to teach me anything, that the best kind of help is the kind nobody ever hears about. Owen Bradshaw taught me that some debts sit with a person for decades, waiting patiently for a way to be paid. I'm still learning how to hold both of those truths at the same time, most days in small, unglamorous ways, choosing to keep mucking out kennels 3 mornings a week instead of walking away entirely, choosing to fund the response fund quietly instead of putting my father's name on anything, choosing, again and again, the version of a story that never needed an audience to still be completely true. What would you have done in my place? Dug for the truth the way I did, or simply let the mystery stay a mystery and enjoyed the peace? I'd honestly love to know, so tell me in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe to Kate's Fortune Stories, because there's always another one waiting. My father would have shrugged the whole thing off and said he was just doing what needed doing. I think, in the end, that's the whole point.